Hey everyone, welcome back to the Cold Blood Files channel. If this is your first time here, you've just entered a space where we dive deep into real-life stories, chilling crimes, buried secrets, and the darkest corners of human history. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any videos that will leave you shaken and thinking. And if you think you've heard all the most disturbing cases in American history, let me warn you, today's story will leave you speechless with horror, and maybe burning with outrage. It was a regular Sunday morning. Little black girls, dressed in their best clothes, were on their way to Sunday school, smiling, rehearsing Bible verses, excited to perform. Minutes later, a deafening blast shattered the walls, ripped the air apart, and scattered tiny, lifeless bodies across the rubble and smoke. The most chilling part? The man behind it, a white supremacist, walked free for nearly 40 years as if nothing had ever happened. Who was he? Why was one of the most horrifying terrorist attacks in American history, that killed 4 innocent girls, buried for decades? And justice, when it finally came, did it come too late? This isn't just a crime story. It's a bloody declaration of war, aimed at an entire generation of black children. Today, we'll unravel the case of Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., a living ghost from the era of the Ku Klux Klan, and perhaps the most haunting reminder that justice may be delayed, but it must never be denied. Part 1, Birmingham, a city that didn't need ghosts, because humans became monsters. Can a city bury justice, even as its streets stay crowded and sunlight still pours through the windows? Birmingham, Alabama, in the early 1960s, was that kind of city. No ghosts were needed. The evil walked on 2 feet and wore a smile. When people hear terrorism, they often picture outsiders, foreign threats, masked strangers. But there was a time in America when the worst terror came from down the street, from men who mowed their lawns, went to church, and believed they were born to dominate. They wore white hoods. They called it purity. And they bombed people to send a message. The Ku Klux Klan, a name that needs no dramatic introduction. In Birmingham, it wasn't just a hate group. It was an underground government. This city became a testing ground for domestic terrorism. More than 50 bombings, all unsolved, happened within a decade. Every single one targeted black residents, or white allies of the civil rights movement. That horrifying track record gave Birmingham a new nickname: Bombingham. If you were black and wanted to buy a home in a white neighborhood, bomb. If your church held a meeting about racial equality, bomb. If you dared to walk next to a white person in protest, bomb. It didn't take much to become a target. Sometimes, just breathing the wrong way was enough. But what made this worse was the silence, or worse, the complicity, of law enforcement. The police barely investigated the bombings. Some officers were reportedly in the Klan themselves. Justice wasn't a system. It was a rigged game, and black families were the pawns. Amid that fear, in the darkness, there were still tiny points of light. One of them was a little church on 16th Street. The 16th Street Baptist Church wasn't just a place of worship. It was a hub. A safe haven. A place where black children were taught hope, love, faith, and dignity. Martin Luther King Jr. preached there. Civil rights marches began from its steps. But that light, that hope, made it a target. The attackers didn't pick a courthouse. They didn't choose a police station. They chose a church filled with children. They knew what time Sunday school started. They knew little girls in white dresses would be inside, singing hymns, praying, laughing. And they still planted a bomb. Not to intimidate. To kill. You might ask, why children? Because that was the cruelest blow. That was how to break a community. Killing adults wasn't enough. But killing children? That was meant to destroy hope itself. In a city where the law wore a hood, evil didn't hide. It strutted, it smirked, and it acted without fear. And then came September 15, 1963, when a bomb exploded in the church basement. Four little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were killed instantly. Over 20 others were injured. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a declaration of war. It would be easy to call this the act of a madman. But no, it wasn't madness. It was calculated. Planned. Fed by years of indoctrinated hate. This wasn't done by a stranger, but by a man who lived among us. An American. A military veteran. A man with a job, a family, and a place in society. His name was Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. No one suspected the man with the ordinary face carried a bomb in his soul. But maybe we shouldn't be surprised. Because society, the air he breathed, the things he was taught, had built him. Each whispered slur. Each family dinner laced with racism. Each church sermon twisted into supremacy. Blanton was not a lone monster. He was a product. And that's the most terrifying part. Not the bomb itself, but the fact that an entire system could create walking bombs, and never even notice. To understand how someone like Blanton could carry out such evil, we need to go back. Back into his childhood, his family, the ideology that shaped him. No one is born a killer. But silence, upbringing, and society's indifference can light a slow-burning fuse. In the next part, we'll peel back the layers of Thomas Blanton's life, and reveal how ordinary soil can grow extraordinary hatred. Part 2, The Making of a Bomber, What Hate Leaves Behind. He didn't come into the world carrying a bomb. He came into it crying, breathing, just like anyone else. But somewhere between his first steps and the day he lit the fuse, something inside him rotted. Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., the man who would one day help carry out one of the most infamous acts of racial terror in U.S. history, was born into a world already soaked in the poison that would later define him. His father, Thomas Blanton Sr., was a well-known figure in Birmingham. Notorious, in fact. A hardcore segregationist, openly racist, loud in both voice and opinion. He wasn't the kind of man who whispered hatred. He shouted it from rooftops. He was the kind who'd show up to a Klan rally like it was Sunday church, wearing his beliefs like a badge of honor. And his son, young Thomas Jr., watched. And listened. The danger of growing up in such a home isn't just the hate you hear, it's the lack of anything else. No voice of reason. No counterpoint. Just a steady diet of paranoia, resentment, and entitlement. It seeps into your bones. It wraps around your conscience like vines around a tombstone, slowly choking anything human that's still alive. And yet, on the surface, Blanton was normal. Ordinary. Boring, even. He went to school. He joined the Navy. He lived like thousands of other white Southern men, quietly carrying the legacy of supremacy without ever questioning it. But beneath that calm was a growing storm. Because what happens when someone raised on hate returns to a society that's beginning, just barely, to change? The 1960s were not a time of peace in Birmingham. They were a time of resistance, yes, but also fury. Black citizens were rising, marching, voting, daring to demand equality. To people like Blanton, this wasn't just change. It was invasion. He came home to a city he didn't recognize. The people he'd been taught were inferior were now organizing. His father's voice echoed in his head, that this was war. That they were taking over. And the Ku Klux Klan. They were ready to weaponize that fear. Blanton didn't need to be convinced. He was already primed. He joined the Klan as if he were fulfilling a family tradition. But unlike some members who liked the parades and robes more than the blood, Blanton was committed. He wasn't there for show. He was there for action. By the early 60s, the Klan in Birmingham had evolved into something darker, more secretive, more violent. They held late-night meetings in basements and barns, planning bombings like military operations. They weren't targeting military sites or political figures. They were targeting churches, schools, children. And Blanton? He became one of the trusted few. Not the leader, not the mastermind, but the kind of man you called when you needed a bomb placed, a threat delivered, a message written in blood. One of the most chilling facts about Blanton is how calm he remained. He wasn't loud like his father. He was quiet, methodical. The kind of man who could light a fuse, walk away, and have dinner with his family as if nothing happened. It was that coldness, that detached, reptilian stillness, that made him dangerous. Years later, when his voice was finally caught on tape during an FBI sting, you could hear it. The lack of remorse, the pride. He spoke about the bombing like it was a joke. He called black people slurs without blinking. He mocked the investigation, boasted about what he knew, and chuckled when talking about murder. It's in those tapes that we see the real monster, not the man society excused as just another racist from the South, but a conscious, calculating terrorist. And yet, for decades, he walked free. Despite strong suspicions, the case remained cold. The FBI had their hands tied. Local law enforcement, riddled with racism, wasn't eager to dig too deep. Evidence was buried. Witnesses were scared into silence. And Blanton, he lived his life, untouched. Imagine that. Imagine seeing the faces of 4 dead girls on the news, and knowing you helped kill them, and still being able to sleep at night. What does that do to a man's soul? Or maybe the better question is, did he ever have one? But the story doesn't end there. Because hate doesn't just hurt its victims. It corrodes everything around it, including the man who holds on to it. In the years that followed, Blanton became more isolated. His family fractured. His name, once a proud extension of his father's legacy, became a whisper of something dark, something shameful. And yet, he never repented. Never apologized. Never doubted. He carried the weight of 4 murdered girls on his conscience, if he had one, like a badge of honor. He never looked back. But justice? Justice doesn't always forget. Sometimes, it waits in the shadows. Sometimes, it takes decades. But it doesn't go away. And when it finally came knocking, Thomas Blanton would learn that no matter how long you hide, truth has a way of digging through even the deepest graves. In the next chapter, we unravel how the long-dormant case was reignited, not by anger, but by courage. Courage from unexpected heroes, journalists, activists, and quiet investigators who refused to let the dead be forgotten. What does it take to bring justice after nearly 40 years of silence? And what kind of price must a country pay to confront the sins it buried alive? Part 3, The Ones Who Wouldn't Stay Silent, They Hunt Through Darkness. Justice doesn't arrive on its own. It must be summoned. Pursued. Even when it means risking death threats, being ignored, or being crushed by the slow, grinding weight of time. After the 1963 bombing, America was shaken. The media screamed. Activists marched. But time, as it always does, moved on. New tragedies took the spotlight. The civil rights movement splintered and shifted. And Birmingham? It fell back into silence. Even worse, the suspects had been known from the very beginning. The FBI had names. They had tapes. They had informants. They had the pieces. But the case never went to trial. Why? The answer is more horrifying than the bombing itself. Because some people didn't want to reopen old wounds. Because some in law enforcement were former or silent supporters of the KKK. Because in the eyes of too many, for little black girls didn't matter enough. Files were locked away. Evidence buried. And the men responsible lived quiet, free lives. But not everyone could sleep at night. A journalist named Jerry Mitchell began digging into cold cases from the civil rights era. He wasn't a cop. Not a judge. Just a reporter with a recorder and a burning question. Why have these men never been held accountable? And he wasn't alone. The survivors. The families of the 4 girls. They were still there. Still hurting. Still remembering. And they wanted justice. They gathered documents. Knocked on doors. Spoke to new politicians. Pressured attorneys. Spoke out. Demanded. And then, in 1993. A turning point. The FBI declassified hundreds of pages of old files. And what was in them? Recordings. Chilling tapes of Blanton casually chatting with friends. Tapes where he bragged about the bombing. Joked about the explosion. Referred to the dead children with sickening indifference. People listening to those tapes felt the hairs rise on the backs of their necks. Not just because of what he said. But because those tapes had been hidden for nearly 30 years. Some witnesses were dead. Others too frail. But the truth? The truth was still very much alive. A new team of prosecutors, untainted by old allegiances, reopened the case. They rebuilt it from scraps. Fragments of memory, forgotten documents, reluctant testimonies. But slowly, they shaped a picture. A horrifying, undeniable picture. Thomas Blanton was no longer a free man. In the year 2000, he was arrested. When agents knocked on his door, he said simply, "I knew this day would come." No anger. No denial. Just stillness. The same chilling calm he'd kept for decades, living like nothing had happened. But this time, silence wouldn't save him. Justice, delayed for far too long, was finally ready to speak. And Blanton would have no choice but to listen. In the next chapter, the long-awaited trial begins. The public would finally hear, in Blanton's own words, what he had once tried to bury in the shadows. But the bigger question remains. Can any sentence truly make up for the blood that's already soaked the ground? And does America have the courage to name him for what he was? Not just a relic of the past, but a domestic terrorist who thought 4 little girls were an acceptable sacrifice. Part 4, A Voice in the Courtroom, the Truth Could Hide No Longer. The courtroom in Birmingham was packed that day. Not because it was an ordinary trial, but because this was something deeper, a confrontation between 2 eras. On one side, a blood-stained, hateful past. On the other, a present struggling to heal through justice. Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., once the quiet shadow behind the horrific 1963 bombing, now sat at the defendant's table. Gone was the smug smile, the confidence of a man who believed he'd gotten away with it. All that remained were tired eyes, darting, avoiding. And around him, the truth waited, closing in like a noose. The prosecutor pressed play on a tape recorder. A rough, unmistakable voice from the past filled the courtroom. Yeah, we bombed the damn church. Cold. Ruthless. But above all, undeniable. The tape went on. Blanton spoke casually of planting the bomb, of sending a message. He even laughed. Laughed about the explosion. The courtroom froze. The women who had once been little black girls in that church now sat in the gallery, no longer children, but survivors in their 50s. Tears streamed down their faces. Not out of fear, but because, for the first time in nearly 4 decades, they were hearing the killer's words. Straight from his own mouth. Blanton never confessed. He never apologized. He just sat there, silent, expressionless. Like a man watching someone else's story play out before him. His defense team argued the tapes were misunderstood. That memories had faded. That he was an old man now, sick and harmless. But that wasn't enough. Not for the names carved in headstones since 1963. Not for the families who lived every day with grief etched into their bones. And not for a society still bleeding from wounds it tried to pretend had healed. The trial stretched on for days. Each piece of evidence cut through decades of silence. Some couldn't bear it, they left. Others stayed, hand in hand, as if to say, "We are still here. And we will not be quiet." At sentencing, the judge looked Blanton straight in the eyes. This man who had once believed the law would never touch him. And said, "At last, justice has prevailed. You will never walk free again." The sentence, life imprisonment. No parole. No second chances. As Blanton was led away, he said nothing. But this time, something was different. He glanced, just briefly, at the families of the victims. And in that moment, the cold confidence was gone. What lingered in his eyes was something else. Defeat. He knew. It was over. No more hiding. No more shadows to melt into. And so, after nearly 40 years, for young souls, buried beneath the rubble of hatred, finally received a piece of justice. But, can a sentence ever truly be enough? Is there anything that could restore what was lost? In our final chapter, we won't just reflect on the aftermath of the case. We'll ask a chilling question. If the ghosts of the past are still lingering in today's society, could they rise again? Or will we, armed with memory and truth, finally break the cycle before it returns? Part 5, Memory that Refused to Die, What Have We Really Learned? America in the 1960s was a country torn in two. One side held hope, where black Americans marched in the streets, held hands, and believed in the dream of justice. The other side was steeped in hatred, white robes, burning crosses, and whispered threats in the night. In that world, for innocent little black girls, Addie, Denise, Cynthia, and Carol, became sacrifices for a message written in blood. They had no weapons. No defense. Only dresses, laughter, and childhood dreams interrupted mid-sentence. The explosion took their lives in seconds. But the pain it caused lingered for decades. A pain no one dared to speak of. As if silence could somehow bury it deeper than the rubble. But it didn't disappear. And when Thomas Blanton was finally brought to trial nearly 40 years later, America was forced to look into a mirror it had long avoided. That courtroom wasn't just the scene of a man on trial. It was a stage where an entire nation had to confront the truths it tried to bury. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived. But justice was not just a verdict. It was a question echoing in the walls of history. What took us so long? The trial of Thomas Blanton wasn't just a symbol of accountability. It was a reminder that crimes do not vanish with time. That silence is complicity. And that history doesn't forget just because it's uncomfortable. Blanton died in prison in 2020. No apology. No expression of regret. Just the quiet fading of a man who once believed he would never be caught. But even as he disappeared, the hatred he embodied still lingers. In systems, in echoes, in shadows we pretend not to see. Look around. Marches for justice. Hushed up racial violence. Generational wounds, still unhealed. Justice may have finally come for the 4 little girls. But this country, it still has promises left broken. And ghosts it hasn't dared to name. So now, from 1963 to today, from the darkness of a bombed church to the cold silence of a courtroom, I leave you with one final question. If silence once protected a killer, what are we staying silent about today? That we'll regret tomorrow. Thank you for staying with me through this chilling but necessary story. If you believe that stories like these deserve to be told, not to spread fear, but to keep the truth alive, then please, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others who care about justice, history, and memory. Every single subscriber helps me continue bringing forgotten voices and buried truths into the light. Once again, thank you for listening. And I wish you a peaceful night. If peace is even possible after hearing this.